She's overthinking again. That's what my wife told the neighbor. About me. I was standing 10 feet away. She said it lightly, almost playful, like I was some harmless, anxious man who built problems out of thin air. But that was the third time that week she'd said it. To someone else. In public. And the strange part? I hadn't said anything out loud. If you've ever felt something was wrong but couldn't prove it, stay with me, because this didn't start with a fight. It started with a pattern, and by the time I realized what was happening, an investigation had already begun. The first time she said I was overthinking, it sounded affectionate. We were at dinner with her sister and brother-in-law. Casual night, pizza, wine, nothing tense. I asked a simple question. Why did you move the money from savings to checking? That was it. She laughed. See, this is what I deal with, she said, smiling at her sister. He overthinks everything. Everyone chuckled. I smiled too, because that's what you do when you don't want to look defensive. But I hadn't overthought anything. I'd seen a transfer notification and asked about it. Later that night, I asked her privately. I wasn't accusing you, I said. I know, but you get fixated. Fixated. The word lingered. I let it go. The second time was at a neighborhood barbecue. We were standing with two couples near the grill. Someone mentioned property taxes increasing. I said I'd noticed a discrepancy on our last statement and planned to call the office. She sighed softly. He stays up reading spreadsheets, she said. He thinks everything is a conspiracy. That wasn't true. I read numbers because I manage a logistics firm. It's part of my job. But the tone she used made it sound obsessive. The others laughed politely. One of the husbands clapped my shoulder. Relax, man. Enjoy life. I laughed too, but something tightened in my chest. Later, when we got home, I asked her again, why do you say that? Say what? That I think everything's a conspiracy. She shrugged. You're sensitive lately. Sensitive. Another word. I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling. It wasn't what she said. It was the consistency. Overthinking, fixated, sensitive. Small labels, harmless on their own, but repetition turns suggestion into reputation. The third time was different. It happened at the bank. We were sitting across from a young advisor reviewing refinancing options. I noticed a line item in the projected closing costs that seemed inflated. I asked him to clarify. Before he answered, she leaned forward. Don't mind him, she said lightly. He gets anxious about small details. Anxious. The advisor looked at me differently after that. More patient, slower, like I needed reassurance instead of answers. I didn't interrupt her. I just watched. On the drive home, I didn't bring it up immediately. She did. You embarrassed me. How? You question everything. It makes us look unstable. Us. I turned slightly in my seat. I asked about a fee. You don't trust anyone, she said quietly. That was no. Trust. Now the pattern felt clearer. I wasn't overthinking. I was being reframed. Over the next week, I started paying attention. Not reacting, just observing. When I expressed confusion about a delayed contractor payment, she said, "You spiral." When I asked why her phone had been face down for hours, she smiled and said, "See, this is what I mean." She never raised her voice, never attacked directly. She softened everything. And that softness was more damaging than anger, because if I pushed back, I looked reactive. If I stayed quiet, the labels settled deeper. One evening, I decided to test something. Her friend Marissa came over for coffee. I deliberately asked nothing financial, nothing investigative, just casual conversation. Halfway through, Marissa mentioned she'd misplaced her car title. I said, "You should double-check your state portal. Sometimes the system glitches." Harmless advice. My wife laughed gently. "He's like this all the time. always preparing for disasters. Marissa smiled awkwardly. I felt it then. The shift. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about fees. It was about credibility. Later that night, I checked our shared credit card statement. 3 unfamiliar charges. A consulting service. I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. I simply asked, "What's this company?" She looked at the screen. "Oh, that's for a workshop." "What workshop?" She paused a second too long. Nothing. Nothing. The next morning, I called the number listed under the charge. A recorded message answered. "Thank you for contacting Meridian Risk Consulting." Risk. Consulting. I hung up slowly. That afternoon, she received a call. I heard her voice from the hallway. "Yes," she said quietly. "He's been increasingly obsessive." I stopped walking. Obsessive. The words weren't whispered. They were clinical, measured. My pulse slowed instead of racing, because suddenly the pattern wasn't vague. It was structured. Overthinking, fixated, sensitive, anxious, spiraling, obsessive. That isn't casual language. That's documentation language. When she ended the call, I stepped into the room. "Who was that?" I asked calmly. She didn't flinch. "Just someone helping me navigate things." "What things?" She studied me carefully. "You're doing it again," she said softly. "Doing what?" "Reading into everything." I didn't respond, because something had shifted inside me. This wasn't about an argument. It wasn't about trust. It was about narrative control. And if there was a consultant involved, then this wasn't random. It was strategic. That night, while she slept, I sat in the living room, not spiraling, not obsessing, just thinking. If someone is quietly building a case around your behavior, you don't fight the labels, you gather facts. The next morning, I called Meridian Risk Consulting. This time, I pressed 0. A receptionist answered. "Yes," I said evenly. "I'm returning a call regarding a marital behavioral assessment." There was silence. Then she said something that made my skin go cold. "Oh, the preliminary file has already been opened."
The preliminary file has already been opened. The receptionist said it calmly, like she was confirming a dentist appointment. I kept my voice steady. "Opened by whom?" "I'm not authorized to share client details," she replied. "If you're calling about your assessment, you'll need to schedule through your referring party." Referring party? "I didn't request an assessment," I said. There was a pause, then a softer tone. "Oh." That single syllable carried weight. Not shock, not confusion. Adjustment. "I'll note that you called," she said carefully. "If there are further steps, someone will reach out." The line clicked dead. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the wall for a long time. Assessment, file, referring party. This wasn't a therapist she'd vented to. It wasn't a friend offering advice. It was structured, professional, documented. When she came home that evening, she was cheerful, almost unusually so. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her bag down. "Productive," I said. She watched me for a second longer than necessary. "You seem calm," she said. "I am." That seemed to surprise her. We ate dinner quietly. At one point, she glanced at her phone and smiled faintly. I didn't ask who she was texting. Instead, I said something deliberate. "I spoke to Meridian today." Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth, just for a second. Then she lowered it carefully. "You did what?" "I called the number from the charge." She set the fork down. "That was private. Not when it's paid from our account." Her posture shifted. Not defensive, strategic. She said, "I was seeking support." "For what?" "For the emotional instability I've been experiencing." I held her gaze. "Your instability?" She didn't blink. "Our instability," she corrected. There it was again. shared language, framed narrative. "You opened a file about me," I said. "I opened a consultation about us," she replied. "That's not what they said." Her jaw tightened slightly. What exactly did they say? That the preliminary file was already opened. Silence stretched across the table. Then she leaned back. "You see," she said quietly, "this is what I mean." "What do you mean?" "You assume there's something malicious happening." I let that sit, because reacting would prove her point. Instead, I asked a different question. "Did you authorize an assessment of my behavior?" She folded her hands in front of her. "I expressed concerns." "To whom?" "To a consultant." "About what?" She inhaled slowly. "Your paranoia." Paranoia. A heavier word now. Clinical. Defined. "Based on what?" I asked calmly. "Your patterns," she said. "Which patterns?" "The constant questioning, the suspicion, the way you catalog everything." Catalog. I almost smiled, because she was right. I was cataloging now, but not before she began labeling. "I ask about finances," I said. "I ask about discrepancies. That's not paranoia. It's fixation," she replied softly. "You moved money without explanation. You interrogated me. I asked. You implied." "No," I said evenly. "You implied." She stood up slowly. "I can't do this tonight," and walked away. I didn't follow her. Instead, I opened my laptop. I searched Meridian Risk Consulting. The website was polished, discreet, specialized in protective documentation for individuals navigating emotionally complex partnerships. Documentation. I scrolled further. Pre-litigation behavioral assessment services. Pre-litigation. The words settled heavily. Divorce preparation, protective orders, custody framing. They specialized in narrative positioning before formal legal action. Not therapy, strategy. My pulse slowed again, because panic wouldn't help. If she was preparing documentation suggesting emotional instability, then the next step would not be conversation, it would be leverage. The next morning, I did something different. I called a private attorney, not to file anything, just to ask questions. If someone consults a behavioral risk firm and documents concerns about a spouse, what's typically the goal? The attorney paused. "Depends," she said. "Sometimes it's divorce groundwork, sometimes custody, sometimes protective positioning in case of escalation." Escalation. What if there's no escalation? Then the documentation itself becomes leverage. I thanked her and hung up. By noon, I did something else. I ordered copies of our joint phone records. Not to spy, to establish timeline. If narrative was forming, facts mattered. That evening, she returned home with a folder. I noticed it immediately. Thin, professional, neutral cover. She didn't hide it. She placed it on the counter deliberately. "What's that?" I asked calmly. "Notes." "From whom?" She hesitated just a little. "From consultations." "About me?" "About our environment." Environment. Abstract language. I stepped closer. "Can I read them?" "No." The refusal was immediate. "Why not?" "Because they're preliminary." "Preliminary for what?" She looked at me carefully. "To determine risk." Risk. I felt something inside me go very still. "Risk of what?" I asked calmly. She didn't answer right away. Then she said quietly, "Escalation." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't step forward. I didn't react. I simply said, "I've never harmed you." She didn't say, "You did." "You're preparing to." That landed. Her expression shifted slightly. "See," she whispered, "you jump." No, I connected. There's a difference. The room felt colder. "Are you planning to file something?" I asked calmly. "I'm planning to protect myself." "From what exactly?" She held my gaze. From unpredictability. That word again. She had replaced overthinking with unpredictability. Escalation, risk, behavioral assessment. This wasn't emotional, it was procedural. And the most unsettling part, she genuinely believed she was justified, because if she reframed my questions as volatility, then her protective strategy felt rational. That night, I didn't confront her again. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I started recording timestamps, conversations, tone. Not secretly, not to trap her, but because narrative without evidence becomes truth. 3 days later, something happened that confirmed everything. I received an email. Subject line, Notice of Informal Behavioral Review.
The email came at 9:12 a.m. Subject line, Notice of Informal Behavioral Review. It wasn't from a court, not from police, not even from Meridian. It was from my employer. I read it twice before the words fully settled. Due to concerns raised regarding potential emotional volatility and workplace spillover risk, we are initiating an informal review. Workplace spillover risk. My chest didn't tighten. It went quiet. My wife hadn't filed for divorce. She hadn't requested a protective order. She had moved first where it would hurt most, my credibility. I closed my office door and reread the email slowly. The review is precautionary and not disciplinary. Precautionary. That word again. Everything about this was framed as protective. Concern, risk, precaution. I walked down the hall to Human Resources. Calm, steady steps. Sandra, the HR director, looked up when I entered. She didn't look accusatory. She looked careful. "Can we talk?" I asked. She nodded and gestured toward her office. Once seated, she folded her hands. "We received a professional advisory notice," she said. "From Meridian Risk Consulting?" I asked. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're aware of them?" "Yes." She paused. "They flagged potential behavioral instability in a domestic environment and advised monitoring." Monitoring. I let that sit. "Did they provide evidence?" I asked. "They provided a consultation summary." "Based on what data?" "Spousal report." "Spousal report." I nodded slowly. "So my wife consulted them." Sandra didn't confirm directly. "We take these matters seriously," she said carefully. "This is not an accusation, it's a precaution." "Have I ever displayed volatility here?" I asked. "No." "Have I ever been written up?" "No." "Have I missed deadlines due to emotional distress?" "No." She inhaled slightly. "But perception risk matters," she said. Perception. That word echoed. This wasn't about behavior, it was about pre-positioned narrative. "If someone claims emotional unpredictability," she continued, "we are obligated to review." "Understood," I said. She studied my face closely. "You seem very composed," she said. "I am." "That's good." Was it? Or was that now suspicious too? I leaned forward slightly. "What does the review involve?" 2 interviews, a behavioral questionnaire, optional third-party consultation. Optional. Nothing was optional. Once a file exists, it grows. "When does this begin?" I asked. "Tomorrow." I stood slowly. "Thank you for informing me." She hesitated. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "this feels procedural, not reactive." I nodded. That mattered. But procedure, once initiated, creates its own momentum. When I returned home that evening, she was cooking. The smell of garlic filled the kitchen. Ordinary,
almost painfully normal. "I got an email," I said calmly. She didn't look up immediately. "Oh?" "From HR." Now she looked up, just slightly. "And?" "An informal behavioral review." She placed the spoon down carefully. "I was advised to notify relevant parties," she said. "Advised by whom?" "Consultants." "Before speaking to me?" Her jaw tightened. "I've tried speaking to you." "When?" "When you spiraled about finances." "When I asked questions?" She shook her head softly. "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Turning everything into cross-examination." That was new. Cross-examination. Legal framing. I stepped back slightly. "Did you tell me I'm dangerous?" "No." "Did you imply escalation risk?" "I described patterns." "What patterns?" She inhaled deeply. "The hypervigilance, the constant surveillance of numbers, the suspicion." "Suspicion." "I'm documenting you," I said quietly. "I'm protecting myself." "From what?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Why are you so calm?" The question surprised me. "Because panic proves your point." Silence fell between us. Long, heavy. Then she said something unexpected. "I didn't expect them to move this quickly." That was the first crack. "Did you not expect HR to act?" "I thought it would stay private longer." Private. So the consultant advised corporate notification, which meant the assessment wasn't about divorce leverage alone. It was about destabilizing my professional standing first. If my employer began questioning my emotional state, my negotiating power in any future legal matter would shrink. Not publicly destroyed, just slightly weakened. That's how credibility erosion works. Not explosions, small shifts. The next morning, I sat across from an external behavioral consultant contracted by my company. Neutral tone, neutral expression. He asked structured questions. "Have you experienced heightened suspicion recently?" "No." "Have you felt the need to monitor your spouse's activities excessively?" "I review joint financial statements monthly." That's not what I asked. He was subtle, very subtle. Questions framed to detect instability. I answered carefully, factually. No defensiveness, no over-explanation. At one point, he paused and studied me. "You're very controlled," he said. "I value clarity." He nodded slowly, then asked something different. "When did your wife first express concern about your behavior?" "After I began questioning irregular expenses." He stopped writing. "Can you specify the expenses?" "Consulting services." "Behavioral consulting?" "Yes." The silence in the room shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. He adjusted his pen. "Did you confront her?" I asked for clarification. "And her response?" She labeled it paranoia. Another pause. Then he leaned back. "I'll conclude the review within the week." When I left the office, I didn't feel relief, because this wasn't over. It had only moved into a new stage. That night, I returned home later than usual. She was sitting at the dining table, folder open, pen resting in her hand. "I have an appointment tomorrow." "With Meridian?" "Yes." "For what purpose?" "To escalate."
To escalate. She didn't say it angrily. She said it like someone scheduling a dentist appointment. Routine. Necessary. Logical. I set my keys on the counter. "What does escalate mean?" I asked calmly. "It means formalizing my concerns," she replied. "Through legal channels?" If necessary. Silence. Not tense, just thick. I walked to the sink and poured a glass of water. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. "What outcome are you hoping for?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she said. That's not true. She didn't deny it. Instead, she said something that shifted the air in the room. "You don't see how intense you are." Intense. Not violent. Not abusive. Intense. "You read between every line," she continued. "You catalog every expense. You track tone shifts in conversations. You call it observation. It feels like surveillance." There it was. Perspective split. From my angle, I was documenting. From hers, I was looming. That didn't make her malicious. It made her interpretive. "When did I last raise my voice?" I asked quietly. "You don't need to," she said. "When did I threaten you?" "You imply." "With what?" "Consequences." The word hung. Consequences. "You mean accountability," I said. She shook her head slowly. "You're doing it again, turning this into a logic exercise." Because it was one. Narratives are logic disguised as emotion. The next morning, she left early, dressed formally. Neutral colors. Professional. I watched from the window as her car pulled away. Then, I did something I hadn't done yet. I requested our home security footage archives. We had installed interior cameras 2 years earlier after a break-in attempt. Mostly hallway coverage. Entry points. Nothing dramatic. Just quiet documentation. If escalation meant legal framing, timestamps mattered. I reviewed the past 6 months. No shouting matches. No physical proximity beyond ordinary living. No aggressive gestures. If anything, the footage showed distance. Her on one side of the living room, me on the other. Phones between us like soft barriers. At noon, my employer called. Sandra's voice was measured. "The preliminary review findings are in," she said. "And?" I asked. "There is no evidence of workplace instability." I exhaled slowly. "But," she added, "there's always a but. They recommended continued observation if domestic litigation begins. So the review didn't damage me, but it didn't clear me either. It left space. That space was leverage." When she returned home late afternoon, she looked composed. Not victorious. Not shaken. Just decided. "They're recommending a formal separation with documentation," she said. That was already happening. This time it's structured. "Through attorneys?" "Yes." "And behavioral affidavits?" She didn't answer directly. "They believe it's safer." Safer for whom? For both of us. That answer felt rehearsed. I studied her carefully. Her breathing was even. Shoulders relaxed. This wasn't fear-driven. It was conviction-driven. She genuinely believed escalation was responsible. "Did they suggest I'm dangerous?" I asked. "They suggested risk increases when patterns are unaddressed." Patterns. Undefined. Flexible. I stepped closer, but kept distance. "Tell me something honestly. If I stopped asking questions tomorrow, would this stop?" She hesitated. "Yes," she said quietly. That was the first real admission. So it wasn't about volatility. It was about resistance. My questions disrupted her structure. My calmness complicated her framing. If I became passive, the narrative dissolved. I nodded slowly. "I won't stop asking questions," she said. "You know, and that's why you're escalating." Yes, there it was. Not hatred. Not revenge. Incompatibility of strategy. That evening, I called the attorney again. If my spouse files behavioral affidavits suggesting escalation risk, what protects me? Consistency. Third-party observation, documentation, witnesses. Not counter-accusations? No. Counter-accusations look reactive. Exactly. So silence remained my strongest defense. 2 days later, she handed me a packet. Formal notice of separation filing. Attached was a preliminary behavioral summary. Phrases underlined. Heightened analytic fixation. Patterned interrogation. Emotional intensity masked as calm. That one almost made me smile. Masked as calm. As if calm itself were suspicious. I read every line slowly. Then I set it down. I'll respond through counsel, I said. She watched my face carefully. You're not upset? She asked. I am, but I'm not unstable. That landed. Harder than anger would have. She turned away first. That told me more than any affidavit. The filing date was set for the following week. The investigation, formal, legal, structured, had begun. But it wasn't criminal. It wasn't violent. It was reputational, psychological. And the most unsettling part? Neither of us believed we were the villain. She believed she was protecting herself. I believed I was protecting the truth. And when two people believe they are safeguarding reality, silence becomes the loudest weapon. The hearing wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no courtroom theatrics, just a conference room inside a family law office. A mediator, 2 attorneys, a recorder running quietly on the table. She sat across from me, calm, focused, slightly tired, not hostile. That surprised me, because this wasn't a fight anymore. It was a sorting process. Her attorney began by outlining the behavioral summary. Same language, heightened fixation, patterned interrogation, escalation risk. He spoke in measured tones, as if reading from a neutral report. My attorney didn't interrupt. When he finished, the mediator looked at me. Mr. Caldwell, she said gently, how would you describe the marriage dynamic? I didn't rush. I let the silence sit. Then I answered. We stopped trusting each other's interpretation of reality. The mediator nodded slightly. Can you expand? I ask questions. She interprets them as threat. She reframes my questions as instability. I document to protect myself. She documents to protect herself. No sarcasm, no heat, just sequence. The mediator turned to my wife. Does that feel accurate? She paused longer than I expected. Yes, she said quietly. That was the first shift, not accusation, acknowledgement. Her attorney cleared his throat. But the pattern of hypervigilance created emotional distress, he said. The mediator looked at me again. Have you ever raised your voice, broken property, made threats? No. Have police ever been called? No. Medical records indicating volatility? No. Silence. Then the mediator asked something unexpected. Why did you continue asking financial questions after she expressed discomfort? I answered honestly, because transparency matters to me. She turned to my wife. Why did you escalate to professional documentation instead of marital counseling? Another pause, because now the pattern was being examined from both sides. I didn't feel safe confronting him directly, she said. Why? The mediator asked. He dismantles everything with logic. That wasn't anger. It was frustration. He makes me feel wrong even when I'm emotional. I inhaled slowly. That was new. Not accusation, impact. The mediator leaned back. So this is not about violence, she said. It's about perception of control. Control. That word reframed everything. My wife looked at me. "For you, clarity equals safety," she said. "Yes. For me, questioning equals surveillance." I didn't argue, because from her emotional vantage point, it did. The mediator tapped her pen lightly. "Neither of you is describing abuse," she said calmly. "You're describing incompatible coping systems." The room went quiet. No escalation risk, no instability, just incompatibility. Her attorney shifted slightly. "But the documentation is protective positioning, not evidence of danger." That was it. Not dramatic, just precise. The air in the room changed. Not in my favor, in neutrality. Her framing didn't collapse, it softened. Because once the conflict was named accurately, the dramatic language lost oxygen. The rest of the session moved toward logistics, asset division, timeline, living arrangements. No protective orders, no behavioral mandates, just structured separation. When it ended, we stood up at the same time. Our eyes met briefly. Not anger, not defeat, something closer to clarity. Outside, in the hallway, she spoke first. "They didn't see what I was afraid of," she said quietly. "Because I wasn't what you feared," I replied. She nodded, but I still felt watched. She added, "That mattered, even if it wasn't my intention." "I felt dismissed," I said. She looked at me carefully. "I didn't mean to erase you," she said. "I didn't mean to corner you," I replied. There it was. No villain, no mastermind, just two interpretations of intensity. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. No public fallout, no professional damage. The Meridian file was archived. No further escalation. And something strange happened after the silence returned. I stopped cataloging, not because I was forced to, but because there was nothing left to defend. In retrospect, I understood something uncomfortable. I wasn't unstable, but I was relentless, and relentless feels threatening to someone who wants emotional space. She wasn't manipulative, she was defensive, and defense, when paired with documentation, looks like attack. We weren't enemies. We were incompatible in how we process uncertainty. The investigation began because fear met logic. It ended because neither side could prove harm, just discomfort. And sometimes discomfort, when stretched long enough, becomes unsustainable. I still track numbers. I still ask questions. But I also pause before pressing. Because not every silence hides deception. Sometimes it hides fatigue. She moved to another city, started fresh. I heard through mutual contacts she's doing well. No crisis, no instability, just distance. And that's what this was all about. Not danger, not paranoia, distance. And once that distance was formalized, the narrative lost its urgency. No one was unstable. We were just standing too close to each other's coping systems and calling it risk.